Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, our Medley Moments. I am thrilled to have a conversation with Kevin Delaney. Kevin and I sure had our paths cross decades ago. He, in a role as a journalist at several publications that would have interacted with Goldman Sachs, whether that's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, where he was the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal Online. He was the founding editor in chief and co CEO of Quartz. I've really gotten to know Kevin, however, over the course of the last several years. We had one shared experience that I think is very relevant here. We both chose to co found a business at the start of COVID. And with my daughter, Jordan Taylor, we co founded Medley, which is a coaching platform that enables people to come together with the help of a coach supported by their employees to really think about what's going on in the work context and the context of life. Kevin and his colleagues founded Charter, a very important newsletter and research and media company that empowers leaders to create a dynamic workplace where everyone thrives. Kevin reached out and said, listen, I think we care about the same things. We want to talk about things that are relevant to creating vibrant, important workplaces where people can thrive. We had planned a conversation and a convening in person. We're going virtual. What do you think? Would you join? And I was thrilled with my co-founder, Jordan Taylor, to have our first conversation actually about Medley with Kevin and the Charter team. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I quickly highlighted a few things about your experiences. I'm sure your mom and your family would be disappointed that I didn't talk about your degree from Yale or your experience here or there. But tell us what really fueled your journey into media and to where you are now at Charter.
Edith, thanks so much for having me today. It's the conversations with you are always the best conversations. And I would say that I'm a journalist and an entrepreneur, and I think it's hard not to be a journalist. It's hard to be a journalist and not be entrepreneurial because our field has changed so much. The days where you sort of stayed at a publication for a long time, are the reality of the industry is that's not an option for a lot of people, and it's not where the greatest personal growth is. So, I grew up in a family of public servants, civil servants, and have always wanted, always been kind of driven by that. And in my, in my career have really valued, I think, something that you've keyed on with Medley a lot, which is this question of organizational culture and how it makes a difference both for individuals, but also ultimately given the spillover into families, communities, society more broadly. So my sort of the thing that drives me is how can the workplace be an engine of positive social, individual, and actually societal growth, development, progress.
And clearly over the time that you have been a journalist, and certainly in the context of Charter, the topics that are front and center to all of us as leaders evolves. Or perhaps the question is, do they evolve? Do you find patterns over the decades that you've really worked on and considered this issue of impact and what's required to really create a thriving workplace?
Yeah. I think it's a really important point. And so the some of the issues that we focus on most are AI and work, flexible working, and inclusion. And these three are issues that are in some ways like the least solved problems for leaders in some ways over the last few years. And so that's what we've wound up focusing on. But actually, when you sort of go underneath these issues, what you come back to so often is what is the model of leadership in these, into these areas. And I think, there are a few paradigms that have proven themselves not to be super successful, across any of the, decades. And that's things like the real command and control models, where you have bosses who refuse to acknowledge dissent, who refuse to live with discomfort, who actually don't trust their workers. We're seeing there's some relevance of that for the RTO debate, where they don't trust people to be working if they're not sitting in a chair in front of them, that kind of thing. And so some of the, I have two quick thoughts. One is like the model of leadership that I find really compelling is one that Ronald Heifetz at Harvard has talked about, this idea of adaptive leadership. And it's that you have some technical problems, which is ones where as a leader, you know the solution and you can just apply the solution. But there are adaptive problems, which are what a lot of the problems we're currently dealing with, where we don't actually know what the answer is. We don't know what the end answer is to AI and work. We don't know what the end answer to a lot of these things is. And that requires a kind of leadership that accepts dissent, that is comfortable with like discomfort. Actually, it's getting a team to kind of stretch themselves in a way, but also is supportive of the human and emotional and well-being aspects of the team, because you just burn people out if you keep them in this sort of place of creation and innovation and unknowing for too long. So I think that that model is one that touches a lot of the things that I think over time have been shown to be really valuable for leaders.
So that's super helpful as a framework, and we'll use that for our conversation. First, let's talk about technology. You recently convened a group at Davos, which is a thought leadership annual conference of literally leaders from across a number of different spectrums. You also had a convening of thought leaders in the AI space, a charter convening on AI. Tell us what's top of mind and what you find most interesting in that space.
Yeah, in the AI space, I think what's really interesting is the ways in which it's finding its way into different aspects of the workplace right now. And you have two things. You have the sort of high level big projects that are like, how do you optimize your supply chain using AI? And that's where, some of the biggest financial gains and savings for organizations are happening. But then you have the more, kind of everyday team level use. And a lot of that is super interesting. One of the things I'm most fascinated by is how people are using AI to kind of better understand their own, how they show up at work. So one example is Dan Shipper. He's the CEO of Every. He gets transcripts of his meetings, and he traditionally has been conflict avoidant. He knows that that's one of his weaknesses as a leader, and so he puts these transcripts into ChatGPT or Claude and says, am I give me feedback. How am I showing up in these meetings? Where am I being conflict avoidant? How can I do things differently? I've done that with, I'm often moderating events like you, and I'll put a transcript of the event in and ask for feedback on it. Fran Katsoutis of Cisco talks about how they had a manager and an employee who are kind of unable to resolve their conflict, and they put a transcript of chats with the employee's permission into ChatGPT, and it allowed them to reach a breakthrough. So I think that there's the work of human support, the sort that Medley is doing, and coaching and groups and human connection is so important. But we're also finding people using these tools in ways that are, in some ways like unexpected, and maybe making them better managers.
And who within organizations have you found to be real drivers of considerations of applications for AI? In my experience is there has to be, and it's very exciting, a real partnership between those that are driving tech within the organization, those that are as driving talent, and of course, others who are running large businesses. Is that consistent with what you've seen in your conversations with leaders across the world?
Yeah, and I think that the best organizations do what you actually just described. The AI is just a technology. It's like the internet or something else, and it's actually how you wind up using it and applying in an organization that ultimately that matters. I think we've been really at Charter. We've been really um, had a lot of focus on the role of the chief human resources officer and all of this and the importance of them actually having a voice in how AI is brought into organizations, the skills that workers need, um, because if it's just a technology project or the project of the CFO to achieve cost savings, it's not going to be as successful. We know that, because most of technology projects ultimately is people, the success or failure when you look at them. And also a lot of organizations' talent is their biggest resource. And if you leave the representatives of talent, or the people who are charged with thinking about talent strategically, out of the conversation, you're really handicapped in terms of what you can build with AI.
Well said, Kevin. If you want to know how and the most effective way to really have people and organizations embrace change, which I think we would all agree is a constant. There's no greater knowledge base for that than those that are responsible for talent in the organization, those that are running it through a CHRO lens or through a recruiting or learning and development lens, and those that are driving day-to-day businesses that are equally close to customers and understand what customers are looking for over time. So let's keep going and talk about workplace dynamic. I think that was the second area that you mentioned. Currently, it's the topic of flexible work, but historically, it has been the concept of how do we make sure that we create opportunities for people who need and thrive with flexibility in the way they work. What's top of mind for you there, and where are we, do you think, in this
Yeah.
journey of conversation about remote work?
Yeah. So I think just to start, I think the research has been pretty convincing to me that for most people in white collar roles, especially where this is possible, the research shows that a hybrid work situation is generally the best for both an employer and employee. That's 2 or 3 days a week in the office. It means you're actually co-located with your colleagues. If you're a younger worker, you have the opportunities to have formal and informal mentoring, and we see this in terms of performance, engagement, et cetera. So I think that that's sort of the starting point for me. What we're seeing now, obviously, is a bunch of private sector employers, and also the White House with the federal government push to 5 days a week, that we are seeing people being brought back into the office. um, I would say that this is generally not as worker friendly, and what we see is that, or actually is generally, like, just to say, is not as good for the business in most cases. And what we see is that there are certain groups in particular who are, there's not enough nuance to the conversation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We saw, the just last week we saw some pushback to, or some questioning of, Jamie Dimon about JP Morgan Chase's policy. And the point that the employee made, was that he's part of a 5-person team, and no other member of his team is actually in the same office as him. And flexibility actually has some benefits for him personally. And so I think that, what I've always felt is that you've got to figure out a way to have, managers and others have some leeway to provide flexibility for people. And what we know is that, the people who value flexibility most tend to be caregivers, which tend to be women, tend to be people from underrepresented groups. And forcing people back into the office 5 days a week, um, over time, the real risk of that is that you become a workplace where those underrepresented groups, aren't able to be represented, and actually have to work elsewhere. So I think there's a cost to that approach.
Yeah,
What Yeah.
please go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say one thing we maybe spend a minute on is, you mentioned briefly, like, this question of historical parallels. And a few years ago, I'd been thinking about, like, the 1970s, and talking to labor and economic historians, like, because we were in a period of high inflation, and what does this mean for workers and so forth. And now I kind of feel like we're in the 1980s, and can draw some of the lessons from there. And you think about Ronald Reagan came in and fired the air traffic controllers, and then the workplace climate for unions actually, it's one of the sort of watershed moments for the decline of labor organization in the US. You look at the rise of managers like Neutron Jack Welch and Chainsaw Al Dunlap, who were, and that's part of the rise of private equity too, and hostile takeovers and different business organizations. But I think that there may be some parallels in the 1980s to what we're seeing. Where we're seeing like sort of bold federal moves, private sector employers um, not always being required to follow them, but maybe actually following the spirit of them. And then the rise of this, ultimately, what I would say were like bad bosses, people with lots of masculine energy who, in the name of creating shareholder value, actually destroyed lots of human capital and ultimately, business capital. We know how those stories played out. So that's one thing. You referred to RTO specifically, but I think that is a historical moment that it's worth, all of our thinking about a bit.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that perspective, Kevin. And I think there are a couple of things that I just want to pinpoint. First of all, you commented that there's nuance here, and I think that that is one of the things that we always have to remind ourselves in any of these conversations. It's the nuance, it's the yes, but that is particularly important for all of us to explore and consider. I've been pretty public in my thinking that it is important for people to convene at work, particularly those that are rising in an organization, because it gives you an opportunity to really set the tone and the culture of the organization, which I think is critically important all the time, but it's particularly important now. When you're there and you're engaging and you are putting yourself in these conversations of problem solving and innovation, you will develop abilities and perspectives that you may not ultimately conclude are 100% in line with your thinking, but no doubt you will broaden your perspective of other ideas. And I think that's really important. I also think it's important to recognize that we know that people can work in a lot of different formats, and there needs to be flexibility with respect to that. I'm very excited by the fact that the conversation around flexible work right now versus perhaps a decade ago is inclusive of the overall workforce. It includes, men, it includes women and others who need the flexibility to make sure that they're maximizing the impact that they have in all aspects of their life. And for me, at the core, we need to make sure as leaders that we are creating that environment that we believe exists, i.e., one where there is this engagement, where there is mentorship, where there is an apprenticeship culture versus just something that we've put out there as a statement that we believe we are aspiring to but not committing to. And that's really important commitment.
Yeah, I totally agree, Edith. This idea, the like sad truth is a lot of bosses are like trying to force people into the office to say that that's where they get mentored and so forth. But then there's not follow through. Folks come into the office and they're on Zoom all day, and their managers aren't really mentoring them, and they're not necessarily learning. And so I think the point that you make is really important, which is that it requires requires like good management, basically, like mentoring people. And the point about young people, younger workers, I think, is also really critical. I just talked to someone who has a fully distributed workplace, so they're fully remote, and they said they tried not to hire young new workers because they didn't have the experience of working in person in a workplace to understand what it was like to be part of a team and to be successful in a workplace. And they saw the struggles of people in a fully distributed workplace to figure that out.
Yeah. So, I have a thinking that a perspective that the more I have an opportunity to engage with people who are coming at things from a different vantage point, whether that's a generational perspective, cultural, ethnicity, the better I'm going to be as a leader, the more my brain hurts, and the more relevant I think I can try to be over time. And that's particularly true with technology. I am not a native technology leader, but I do know that if I don't, understand how people are showing up and how powerful these tools are, particularly given where I am and the organizations I'm engaged with from a director perspective, that would be problematic. And I think that is extraordinarily exciting for all of us. But we have to take advantage and invest in what we need to do there. Okay, so the third thing that you highlighted, which I think is part of the workplace dynamics and the evolution of dynamics, is what we've been talking about, which is really creating an environment where people can get the work done in an extraordinary way, in a innovative way, and in a high impact way. And that would mean that we need to, as leaders, be inclusive, using your reference. Comment a little bit on that, particularly as you gathered in Davos or at the convenings that Charter holds over the year. How are you thinking about that, and what are you hearing from leaders with respect to how
Yeah.
to create an inclusive environment?
Yeah, I think it's a really, it's obviously a really intense moment around, inclusivity, and also in, specifically the DEI practices of organizations. And, I would say what I'm hearing is that there's, a fair amount of concern around the legal risks, actually, specifically, and some of the reputational, um, concerns around having these practices. I think what's really clear right now is that the practices that are problematic from a legal standpoint are ones that involve quotas. So specific number of managers, need to be of a certain underrepresented group, each year, that sort of thing. And that legally the support for that has really fallen away. But what you find is actually a lot of the other practices that organizations use that ultimately create inclusive environments actually are like quite legal and can be open to people from all groups in ways that actually could potentially benefit everyone. And I think the approach, if you're thinking about sort of leveling the playing field as the dynamic that you're looking for, there are practices like mentorship, for example, support for caregivers, pay transparency or pay equity. These are things that are actually, kind of general practices that you can apply across your organization. But ultimately, what research shows, they actually have disproportionate benefit for folks from underrepresented groups, and you know, and ultimately do help level the playing field. I would say that what I'm hearing from organizations is that having inclusive workplaces is not something that they can abandon for the most part. And part of it is that they realize, Edith, as you said, like having inclusive workplaces is key to their business success. It's key to their ability to serve their clients. And if they don't have if not, they're only able to attract a certain or retain a certain type of talent, or from a specific demographic or socioeconomic group, they're not actually they're not accessing all of like the great talent that would be available to them otherwise, and their clients require that they have the highest level of talent. So what we're finding, and there just one last thing, which is that I just saw a survey of DEI executives at large companies that was done by board.org very recently. And about 90% of them said that the support among stakeholders for their DEI initiatives had not decreased recently. But 73% of them said that they had changed how they were communicating about DEI internally and externally because of political pressures or pressures from their leadership. And so, kind of what you're seeing is that people are trying to figure out how to have inclusive workplaces because it's a requirement of business, but they're also realizing that they have to be more careful about how they communicate about it in this moment because of legal and business risks that it entailed. A last thing is that it is the sort of current moment is taking its toll on some folks, and so roughly almost half of the DEI leaders surveyed by board.org said that they had considered a career change over the last 3 months because of the current climate for the work that they're doing. So they're, almost half of them are considering exiting the DEI field, given all the noise around it.
Well, thank you for sharing your observations and the perspectives that organizations like board.org have highlighted. I would say simply that there is no organization that I'm aware of, certainly none that I've been associated with, that doesn't recognize that it starts with excellent people. And if you do go down a path of narrowing the definition of what is excellent, my view, and I think it's supported by historical data, you're limiting yourself. And so therefore, as an organization. And so, I think it is really critically important that we as individuals show up with a continued commitment to engage and to create opportunity that will make us all smarter and more impactful. Thank you for sharing that. I would be remiss if we concluded our conversation without spending a little bit more time on your personal journey, Kevin. What has been for you, um, uh, when you look at your career and you look at your future, the most important tenets of your approach to leadership? And what advice would you give to those who are listening to our conversation with how to really show up for impact? Going back to the culture of your upbringing and your family, how do you show up for impact?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your answer to that, Edith. I'll give you a quick one. I think, if I have any advice for folks about careers, particularly younger workers, it's just follow the path of the greatest personal professional growth. And I think, when you're 25 and you're not stretching yourself and you're not, taking on the stretch assignments or moving to roles that challenge you more, the difference between you and your peers may not seem that significant. But by the time you get to be 35, if someone has spent 10 years stretching themselves and you haven't, the difference between your, how you show up in a workplace, the skills you bring, the experience, the trust, like how your value to an organization is vastly different. And so I think particularly for younger workers, like always seeking out the opportunity to grow their skills and their perspectives is, it may not be clear in the moment kind of what the value of that is, and it may be actually feel kind of anxiety inducing to put yourself in places of discomfort, but I think that's really critical. And I would say, that stands like throughout careers. The folks who are most successful in the moment in navigating some of the changes that AI is bringing are the leaders who actually themselves are using it. They're the ones who are showing vulnerability and experimenting, and they may not be, the most digital native folks, but they're putting themselves out there as people who want to figure it out and understand and apply it in ways that actually support workplaces. In terms of impact, like my theory is that there are lots of people who want to, because I found myself in this situation, who want to actually see better workplaces where more workers thrive, that are engines of societal good and progress, but they don't necessarily know or have the confidence to do the things that could be part of the change there. And so my theory is that just showing through, your own example and part of what we're really trying to do with Charter is like share research and case studies of organizations that are in some cases pushing the edge of traditional practices in service of actually being better workplaces for their workers and ultimately for their business performance. And so that is sort of core of how I'm hoping for change and a spillover from workplaces into our broader society.
Thank you so much, Kevin. In our final seconds, would you share a little bit more about Charter and how
Thank
people can learn more and engage with this extraordinary community of thought leadership that you and your colleagues have built over the last years?
Yeah, Edith, thanks so much. So Charters, as you said, is the beginning is a future of work media and research company, and we have a free newsletter that folks can sign up for, which is probably the best way to keep up with the work we're doing. You can go to charterworks.com and sign up right there. And then we're just constantly doing research and reporting to try and understand the best practices and use cases in these areas that include especially AI and work, flexible working, and inclusion. And we often convene folks for the Charter Workplace Summit, Leading with AI Summit, and other events where we bring people. And we've been fortunate, Edith, to have you part of a bunch of these events over the years. So thanks for this conversation, and thanks for your support for this work.
Well, Kevin, I have to say, I always find our conversations thought-provoking. You and we never shy away from the complicated conversations. In fact, I think that's what draws us together. And I am thrilled to have an opportunity to share just a tidbit of the types of things we talk about in this Medley Moments conversation. So I think that's it for today. Thank you again for those that have joined live and those that listen after the fact, and we look forward to having you join our next conversation. And Kevin, I look forward to seeing you soon.
Great. Thanks, Edith.
Take care. Bye-bye.